Story number 1. The Dollhouse in the Attic. Lily had always been curious. It was a quality her mother often said she inherited from her grandmother, a woman who had a habit of poking into places that were best left alone. But Lily was a good girl, or at least she liked to think so. She didn't cause trouble. That is, until she found the dollhouse in the attic. It was a hot afternoon when she first stumbled upon it, while the rest of the house hummed quietly below her. Her parents were busy downstairs, lost in their own worlds. Her mother was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, and her father had his nose buried in his study papers. It was the perfect time to explore. The attic was a place Lily had always been warned to stay out of. Too many old things, her mom would say. But Lily wasn't afraid. She wasn't afraid of dust or cobwebs. What she didn't know was that the attic was hiding something far worse. The narrow staircase creaked beneath her feet as she ascended into the dim space. The smell hit her first, musty, thick, and heavy with the weight of old memories. Boxes were piled high, their contents long forgotten. But in the far corner, near the window, something caught her eye. There it was, a dollhouse. At first, Lily thought it was just a regular, dusty old thing, something her parents might have picked up at a yard sale. But as she drew closer, a strange feeling crept over her. The dollhouse was too perfect. Every window, every door, every tiny piece of furniture. There was something unnervingly familiar about it. She crouched down beside it, her fingers brushing the polished wood. It looked like a miniature version of her own house. There was a small porcelain doll standing in the front yard of the house. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, a smile frozen on her face. Lily reached out to touch the doll, but as her fingers brushed its smooth cheek, she felt a shiver run down her spine. She quickly pulled her hand back, heart racing. "I'm just imagining things," she muttered, shaking her head. But from that moment on, she couldn't help herself. Every day after school, she would sneak up to the attic and sit in front of the dollhouse. She would rearrange the tiny dolls, pretend they were a family like hers. She even began to notice odd little things. One day, the dollhouse family seemed to mimic what had happened in her own life that day. The father doll would sit down at the tiny wooden desk just as her own father sat down at his desk in the study. The mother doll would bustle around the kitchen just like her mom. Even the dog would run to the front door whenever Lily came home from school, just like her real dog, Buddy. At first, it was harmless fun. Lily would giggle as she moved the dolls around, recreating her own day with them. But then things started getting strange. One evening, as she played, she noticed something unusual. The dollhouse family was acting out what had happened earlier in the day, just as usual. The father doll had sat down at the desk, the mother had started to cook, but then something happened that Lily hadn't expected. The little girl doll, the one with the wide eyes and a crooked smile, suddenly moved on her own. Without any help from Lily, the doll stood up, walked to the edge of the dollhouse, and looked directly at Lily. Lily's breath caught in her throat. She froze. The doll's eyes, which had always been lifeless and painted with a perfect smile, now seemed to stare right through her. The girl doll reached out with stiff fingers, as though it wanted to grab her hand. Lily slammed the lid of the dollhouse shut, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound of the wooden lid closing echoed through the attic like a warning. She didn't go back to the dollhouse that night. But the next evening, when she returned, something was wrong. The dolls weren't in their usual places. They were scattered across the floor of the dollhouse, some face down, some facing the wrong way, as though they had been tossed aside in a hurry. And then Lily noticed it. The dollhouse was different. The wallpaper inside the tiny house, which had always been a soft, faded floral print, now looked dark. The patterns twisted and strange. The walls seemed to pulse, as if they were alive. Terrified, Lily stood frozen, her hands trembling. She reached out again, hesitantly, and placed her hand on the dollhouse's roof. A cold shock ran through her, and before she could pull away, she felt the weight of something heavy, something sinister, settle over her. She stepped back, but the air around her seemed thick with unease. That's when she saw it. A figure standing at the top of the stairs in the dollhouse. It wasn't one of the dolls. It was a shadow, human in shape, its face obscured by darkness. Lily stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to scream, but her voice was lost in the terror that paralyzed her. The shadow moved, slowly, deliberately, toward the door of the dollhouse. And then, it did something she couldn't explain. The dollhouse door swung open on its own, the tiny hinges creaking as it moved, and the shadow stepped out. Lily turned and ran down the stairs. She didn't look back. She didn't even stop to catch her breath. All she could hear was the echo of the footsteps behind her, following her, getting closer. The dollhouse in the attic was never found again. Some say it's still up there, hidden under layers of dust and cobwebs. But the attic is locked now, and no one goes up there anymore. Lily never spoke about the dollhouse again. But every now and then, when the house is quiet, she swears she can hear the soft, creaking sound of tiny footsteps from the attic, and she wonders if maybe, just maybe, the dolls are still waiting for her to come back. Story number 2. The Whispering Oak. The small town of Elmswood was quiet, the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen, and people were always quick to remind you of that fact when you asked. The streets were lined with old houses, the kind that had seen better days but still stood with a sort of stubborn pride. The only thing that seemed to stir the air on warm summer evenings was the wind, which whispered through the branches of an ancient oak tree in the town's cemetery. The tree was massive. Its gnarled roots curled like old fingers, and its branches spread wide, blocking out the moonlight, casting long shadows on the ground below. It was said to be hundreds of years old, maybe older. The townspeople had a lot of stories about it. Some said it was haunted, others swore it was cursed. But the most terrifying rumor of all was that the oak whispered at night. No one really knew what it whispered, but the kids in Elmswood liked to pretend they did. They would dare each other to stay close to the tree after dark, daring each other to listen, to hear its voice, and to prove they weren't afraid. It was all a game until the night they decided to go too far. It started with Jimmy. He was always the bravest of the bunch. At least, that's how he liked to think of himself. He had a way of convincing the others to do things they normally wouldn't. So, one night, after a day of endless summer heat, Jimmy made the challenge. Let's spend the whole night under the Whispering Oak. The others, Sarah, Mark, and little Danny, hesitated at first. There was a reason the town's adults avoided the tree after dark. No one ever spoke about it, but everyone knew. Strange things had happened near that oak. Some said people had disappeared without a trace. Others claimed to hear footsteps following them long after they'd left. But Jimmy was persistent. He promised nothing would happen. It was just a tree, after all. They were just kids. So, with the sun dipping below the horizon, they gathered their things and trudged to the cemetery. The air felt heavier than usual, like the whole town was holding its breath. When they reached the tree, they could already hear it. Soft whispers, so faint they could barely make out the words. At first, it seemed like the wind, but then they realized the leaves weren't moving. Sarah shivered, her fingers brushing against the bark of the oak. "Do you hear it?" she whispered, but no one answered. The whispers grew louder as night fell, filling the air with voices that seemed to come from all directions. The sound wasn't clear enough to understand, but it felt familiar, like someone you knew was speaking just out of reach. Every now and then, the whispers would fade, only to return stronger, closer. The air turned cold, the ground beneath them damp, as if the oak had suddenly woken up. Then, things began to shift. Mark was the first to notice something strange. He felt a tug on his foot. At first, just a light pressure, almost like a vine brushing against his ankle. But when he looked down, he saw that the roots of the oak had begun to stir, creeping toward him slowly but deliberately. "Guys," Mark's voice trembled. "There's something moving under the ground." Jimmy scoffed, but his laughter died in his throat when he saw it too. The roots, thick and twisted, were now winding around Mark's feet, pulling him toward the base of the tree. "Mark!" Sarah screamed, grabbing his arm, but the roots were stronger than they looked. They tugged and twisted, pulling him deeper into the soil. Mark's face twisted in fear as the roots curled around his legs, his body jerking helplessly. "I can't!" he gasped, his voice cracking. "It won't let go." The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though the oak was feeding on his fear, urging him to let go. The ground around them rumbled, and the branches above began to sway in a way that wasn't natural. The air grew thick with an overwhelming presence, something ancient and hungry. Then, as quickly as it started, Mark was gone. One moment he was there, screaming for help, and the next, the ground swallowed him whole. The roots had dragged him into the earth, leaving behind nothing but a patch of disturbed soil and the faint echoing whispers of the oak. Lily stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do we do?" she screamed. Jimmy turned to run, but before he could take a step, the ground shifted again. The oak's roots stretched toward him, faster this time, like they were closing in. But it wasn't just the roots. The tree's voice, low and almost a growl now, seemed to call his name, filling the air, slipping under his skin. It knew him, knew all of them. Lily tried to pull Danny away, but the child seemed entranced. His eyes were wide, staring at the tree as though it had a hold on him. "Danny, no!" she cried, but Danny took a step forward, his small body moving toward the base of the tree, toward the gaping, dark roots. They called to him, pulling him in with their whispers, their promises. He reached down, his fingers brushing the cold soil, and that's when Lily heard the whispers louder than ever before. They weren't just whispers anymore, they were words. They were the deepest fears of each of them, their regrets, their secrets, their brokenness, rising from the earth, wrapping around their souls. Lily yanked Danny back, but she knew. She knew they had to leave. They had to get away from the tree before it claimed them, too. They ran, but the whispers followed, trailing behind them like a shadow. Even as they sprinted back to town, she could still hear it in the wind. The oak's voice, whispering their names, calling them back, reminding them that it was waiting. And in the years that followed, when people spoke of the whispering oak, they did so in hushed tones, warning their children never to go near it, never to stay after dark. But some things never change. Some whispers are too tempting, too haunting. The tree waits, its roots twisting beneath the soil, pulling at the hearts of those who dare to listen. And in the quiet of the night, when the wind is just right, you might hear it too. The whisper of the oak, calling, waiting for the next soul. Story number 3. The Reflection. Ethan had never liked the basement. It was the kind of place that felt wrong, like something was always just out of sight, waiting for you to turn your back. But it was also the kind of place his mom always told him not to go. That made it all the more tempting. It was on a lazy Saturday afternoon that Ethan finally decided to face the basement. His mom had gone out for groceries, and his dad was in the garage, tinkering with something he called a project. The house was quiet, too quiet, and Ethan figured it was the perfect time to explore. He'd been in the basement before, of course, but never on his own. Never when it was just him and that creeping silence. The stairs creaked beneath his feet as he descended. The air smelled musty, like old books and forgotten things. The basement was cluttered, filled with boxes and old furniture draped in dusty sheets. But there, in the corner, hidden beneath a pile of old blankets, was something that caught his eye. An old mirror. It was large, too large for the space it occupied, with a dark wooden frame that looked like it had been carved years ago, maybe even centuries. The glass, though, was what drew Ethan in. It wasn't just the reflection of the dimly lit basement. No, it was the way the reflection seemed to shimmer. Or was it shift? Ethan stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. At first, he saw only himself. A scruffy 12-year-old with messy hair, dressed in a faded t-shirt and jeans. But as he stared into the mirror, something changed. Just behind him, standing in the shadows, was a figure. A shadowy, indistinct form. It wasn't his own reflection. The figure was tall, its features dark and blurry, but it was there. Ethan froze, his pulse quickening. It didn't make sense. He whipped around, but no one was there. He turned back to the mirror. The figure was still standing behind him. The air felt colder. He swallowed hard, feeling his skin prickle with unease. "Just my imagination," he muttered to himself, stepping back from the mirror. But no matter how much he tried to shake the feeling, the figure stayed. It was closer now, just a few inches behind him in the reflection. Its shape seemed more defined, the outline of its head a little clearer, its shoulders broader. It felt wrong, like the reflection wasn't a reflection at all, but something else. Something that was watching him. The next few days were a blur of confusion and dread. Every time Ethan went into the basement, the mirror was there, waiting. And every time, the figure grew closer. At first, it was just a vague shadow. Then, it started to have a shape. A tall, thin figure with dark, hollow eyes. Its face was a blur, but Ethan could feel it staring at him, watching him. He tried to ignore it, to tell himself it wasn't real, but it was always there. Always just behind him, its presence heavy in the room. One night, after an evening of avoiding the basement, Ethan finally couldn't take it anymore. He had to face it. His hand trembled as he reached for the old mirror. He stared at his reflection first, then glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the figure standing right there. But no, it was closer this time. So close that it looked like it was almost touching him. His heart pounded in his chest. The figure's face was clearer now, its eyes dark pits of emptiness. Its lips stretched into a thin, crooked smile, one that made his stomach turn. He could feel its presence pressing in from behind. The air felt heavy, thick, suffocating. It was as if the figure was alive and ready to reach out from the mirror. Ethan couldn't take it anymore. With a cry of panic, he grabbed a nearby metal object, a wrench, maybe, and slammed it into the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, shards falling to the floor in a cascade of sharp, jagged pieces. He stood there, panting, his hands trembling. The basement was silent again. But as Ethan looked around, a cold wave of dread washed over him. The figure was gone. There was nothing in the reflection now but the empty basement, just his own panicked face staring back at him. He felt a surge of relief. It was over. The mirror was broken, the shadow was gone. But as he turned to leave, a chill ran down his spine. A soft, scraping sound came from behind him. He froze. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned back around. His heart skipped a beat. The figure wasn't in the mirror, but it was standing right there in the corner of the basement, just beyond the broken glass. It was tall, impossibly tall, its eyes wide and empty, its grin twisted into something horrible. And the worst part? It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was real. Ethan stumbled back, his throat dry, his mind screaming for him to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The figure took a step toward him, its long limbs stretching unnaturally, and the air around it seemed to vibrate with a cold, unnatural energy. Ethan opened his mouth to scream, but the sound never came. The last thing he heard was a soft, distorted voice coming from the thing that had once been a shadow. "Now," it whispered, "it's your turn." And then, everything went black. The next morning, Ethan's mom found the basement door wide open, the floor littered with shards of broken glass. But Ethan was gone. No one ever saw him again. And the mirror? It was gone too, as if it had never been there at all. The basement was empty, save for the dust and the remnants of broken glass. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is still, you can hear the soft scrape of something against the walls, like fingers dragging across the floor. And if you listen closely, you might just hear a whisper, a voice, calling you by name. It's always waiting. Story number 4. The Sandman's Game. It was a cold, dreary afternoon when they first found it. Ben, Claire, Olivia, and Jake had spent hours wandering around the town, trying to kill time. It wasn't like they had anything else to do. It was a Saturday, and the weather was too miserable to do much of anything else. The wind had picked up, and the sky was a solid gray, so they ducked into an old, dusty thrift store on the edge of town to escape the chill. The place smelled of old wood, mothballs, and forgotten memories. It was the kind of shop that had everything. Books stacked in corners, old records that no one had touched in years, and shelves full of trinkets. But it was the game that caught their eye. It was buried beneath a pile of old board games, sitting quietly in the back of a dim corner. A plain, dark box with no name, only a strange symbol. 2 crescent moons facing each other, with a tiny star between them. Ben, the most curious of the group, pulled it out. "What is this?" he asked, brushing off the dust. The box felt strangely heavy in his hands, and the air around it seemed just a little bit colder. Claire peered over his shoulder. "It's some kind of old game. I've never seen anything like it." "Let's play it," Olivia said, always the adventurous one. "What else do we have to do today?" They didn't hesitate, even though something about the game felt off. The thrill of trying something new pulled them in. They bought it from the old man behind the counter, who didn't seem to care much about anything. He gave them a knowing look, but said nothing as they left with the box tucked under Ben's arm. Back at Jake's house, they set up the game in his dimly lit living room. The rules were simple enough: move pieces around the board, collect tokens, and reach the center to win. But as soon as the game began, something felt strange. The board was unnaturally quiet. The pieces, small wooden figures, moved on their own when they weren't looking. At first, it was subtle. A slight shift of a pawn, the faintest sound of a piece scraping against the board. But the more they played, the more things started to change. "Did anyone move that?" Claire asked, pointing at her piece, which had shifted several spaces ahead without her touching it. Ben frowned. "No, I didn't. That's weird." And then the shadows. It was subtle at first. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow longer, stretching across the floor. No matter how many lights they turned on, the dark corners of the room remained deeper than they should have been. Every time they looked away, they felt the shadows shift. "What's going on?" Jake asked, his voice a little shaky now. He was always the skeptic, the one who dismissed anything strange with a laugh. But this was different. And then, the toys started to move. They were scattered around Jake's living room, old action figures, dolls, and stuffed animals from the shelf. At first, it was one of the toy cars, just a faint squeak of wheels, then the soft rumble of it rolling across the floor. Then, the toys began to stand. They shuffled across the room like they had minds of their own, as if they were alive, and somehow they were playing along with the game. Ben's hand trembled as he rolled the dice. The board glowed faintly now, the same symbol, the two moons and the tiny star, shining through the cracks in the wood. It pulsed like it was breathing. "You guys, something's not right," Ben said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we should stop," Olivia suggested, but there was something in her voice, something that sounded almost desperate. They all felt it now. The game wasn't just a game anymore. It was alive, and it was playing them. Suddenly, the room seemed colder, the air heavier. A low hum filled the space, like something was coming to life. The toys, now all facing them, began to make sounds. The dolls whispered to each other in voices they couldn't quite understand, and the action figures moved in unison, their eyes locking onto them. The whispers were getting louder. The shadows were shifting, growing, taking shape. And in the reflection of the window, they saw something that made their blood run cold. A figure, tall and thin, standing in the corner of the room, just beyond the light. It was impossible to see its face, but they all knew it was watching them, waiting. "How do we stop it?" Claire asked, her voice cracking. But there was no answer. The game was making its demands now. Each roll of the dice led them further into its grip. Every space they landed on gave them a new challenge, a new choice. And with each choice, the room seemed to close in on them, like the walls were pressing in. The figure in the corner moved closer, its shadow stretching across the floor, crawling toward them. Its eyes, black and endless, seemed to burn into their souls. "You have to finish the game," the voice came, not from the figure but from everywhere. "Only then will you be free." But freedom wasn't the game's goal. The game had a purpose. It wanted them to make choices, terrible choices. It wanted them to break, to face their darkest fears, and make the impossible decisions that only nightmares could bring. One by one, the group was forced to make their choices, their lives slipping further and further into the game's grip. Ben was the first to fall, his face pale and blank as he moved his piece across the board, only to be trapped in a dark corner, his mind overwhelmed by visions of his worst nightmare. Claire followed, her breath quick and shallow as the shadows took her, pulling her into their depths. Jake tried to fight, but the game had already won. Olivia was the last to move. She was the strongest, the one who had pushed them into this mess, but even she couldn't escape the game's twisted rules. She felt herself being drawn into it, into the dark, into the endless, haunting whispers of the Sandman. She could hear it in the distance now, its footsteps, growing louder with every passing second. The game was still playing, and they were the pieces. No one ever saw them again. The game was found the next day, sitting quietly on the table, the pieces scattered, the symbol glowing faintly in the dark. But the shop that had sold it? It was gone, as though it had never existed at all. The Sandman's game was waiting for its next players, and it always found them. Story number 5. The Toymaker's Curse. Liam had always loved visiting his grandfather's house. The old, creaky house on the edge of town, tucked away behind a forest of thick trees, had a way of feeling like a secret. It wasn't the kind of house anyone would stop at unless they knew what they were looking for. But Liam always knew it was special, even if it smelled of musty books and had the kind of silence that made you feel like time had forgotten it. When Liam's grandfather passed away, Liam didn't know what to expect. He was only 12, too young to really understand loss, but old enough to feel the emptiness left behind. His mom and dad were busy sorting through papers and making calls, but Liam had other things on his mind. The day they were supposed to clear out his grandfather's things, Liam's dad called him over. "There's something I think you should have," his dad said, his voice distant, like he was somewhere else, thinking about something else. He handed Liam a small wooden chest. It was old, too old really, covered in layers of dust. The chest creaked when Liam opened it. Inside were wooden toys, a carved horse, a small soldier, a wooden ball and cup, and a doll with an unsettling smile. They looked harmless enough, but there was something about them that made Liam uneasy. They weren't the kind of toys kids played with today, and the way they had been carved was intricate but strange, with faces that seemed a little too real. "Your grandfather made these," his dad said, eyes clouded with something Liam couldn't place. "He was a toy maker, you know. These were his best." Liam nodded, but he didn't feel excited about getting them. There was a weight to them, a kind of heaviness that wasn't physical. The toys didn't seem like something to be played with. They felt like something meant to be locked away. But as the days passed, Liam couldn't shake the feeling that they were somehow important. He kept them on his shelf in his bedroom, the horse and soldier staring back at him from the small wooden chest. At night, when the wind howled outside and the trees scratched against his window, Liam would hear things. Soft whispers, low, almost inaudible sounds that seemed to come from the direction of the toys. At first, he told himself it was just his imagination, that it was the wind or the house settling. But as the whispers grew louder, he started to wonder if it was something more. One night, when he was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, he heard a noise. It was soft, like wood scraping against wood. He sat up, heart racing, and looked over at the shelf. His eyes widened. The toys had moved. The wooden soldier, which had been placed neatly beside the horse, was now standing up. Not perfectly still, but in a way that looked like it was about to walk. The doll, with its painted smile, was facing him, staring. Liam tried to laugh it off. He'd been tired lately. Maybe he had knocked them over and forgotten about it. But that didn't explain the feeling, the sudden cold that ran down his spine, or the way his heart seemed to beat louder when he looked at them. The next night, things got stranger. Liam woke up to the sound of whispering again, but this time, it wasn't just faint. It was clearer, sharper, as though the toys were speaking directly to him. He sat up, frozen. He had to see it. He had to make sure he wasn't imagining things. The toys were moving. The wooden horse was trotting across the shelf, its tiny hooves tapping against the wood. The soldier's arm twitched, holding his weapon at a strange, unnatural angle. And the doll, her smile, oh, that smile, it had grown wider. Wider than it should have been. Liam felt his chest tighten. The whispers turned into words. "Play with us, Liam." The voice wasn't the voice of a child or of anyone he knew. It was old, ancient. It crawled into his mind, making his skin crawl. He was terrified, but he couldn't look away. He wanted to scream, but something stopped him. A force, something he couldn't explain, kept him rooted to the bed. The next day, things got worse. The toys weren't just moving when he wasn't around, they were mimicking him. The soldier raised its arm when Liam lifted his own. The horse galloped when Liam ran his fingers through his hair. The doll, it tilted its head whenever Liam turned his own. They were watching him, waiting. Liam tried to hide the toys, stuffing them in drawers and under his bed. But every time he turned his back, they were there again, sitting on the shelf, staring at him with those same strange, knowing eyes. And the whispers grew louder, more urgent. They weren't asking anymore. They were demanding. "Play with us, Liam. Be one of us." The last straw came when Liam woke up one night to find that the toys weren't just mimicking him. They were becoming him. The soldier's uniform looked like his pajamas. The horse's mane was now his own hair, and the doll, it had Liam's face. It was then that Liam understood. The toys weren't just toys. They weren't just wooden figures his grandfather had carved out of love or nostalgia. They were something else, something cursed. They weren't just alive. They wanted to be alive, as him. They were replacing him. In a panic, Liam grabbed the toys and ran downstairs to his father's workshop. He didn't know what he was doing. He just knew he had to destroy them, to stop whatever force had taken over them. He threw them into the furnace and watched as the flames devoured them, the twisted figures screaming in the fire. For a moment, there was silence. But then, from the depths of the furnace, a voice whispered, "You can't destroy us, Liam. We are your family now." Liam screamed, but the voice was already fading. He turned around, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The toys were gone, but the air in the room was still thick, still wrong. He never told anyone about what happened that night. How could he? Who would believe him? But every now and then, when he walked past the shelves in his room, he'd swear he saw something, just for a second. A shadow moving out of the corner of his eye. And sometimes, late at night, when the house was still, Liam would hear the whispers again. "Play with us." And he knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. It would never be over. Story number 6. The Forgotten Room. Megan had always been drawn to the old house at the end of Maple Street. Her parents had bought it when she was just a little girl, and since then, it had always felt like a place of mystery. The house was big, too big for their small family, and with all the creaky floors and dusty corners, it often felt like it was hiding something. Sometimes, late at night, when Megan lay awake in her room, she could swear she heard soft noises. Scratching, shuffling, like the house itself was alive, whispering in the dark. But it was one particular afternoon that things changed. Megan, now 14, had grown bored with the usual routine of homework and video games. Her parents were downstairs, arguing about bills, and Megan was alone for the moment, trying to find a distraction. She had wandered through the house countless times. Yet, there was always something new to discover, some odd corner or strange door she hadn't noticed before. It was in the old library, where the shelves towered above her, that she found it. She had been looking for a book, something to pass the time, when she noticed that one of the bookshelves wasn't quite lined up with the others. The gap between two large shelves was barely noticeable, but enough to catch her eye. Curiosity stirred inside her, and she pushed on the shelf. It didn't budge at first. Megan frowned, then gave it another shove, harder this time. To her surprise, the shelf moved. A door. Behind the bookshelf, hidden for who knows how long, was a small wooden door. It was old, the wood darkened by years of dust and neglect. Megan's heart skipped a beat. She'd spent years in this house and she'd never seen a door like this before. She stood there for a moment staring at it, unsure of whether she should open it. It felt wrong somehow, like she wasn't supposed to find it. But then again, she was the type to chase after mysteries, to peer behind the curtains of things that weren't meant to be seen. So, with trembling hands, she turned the old brass knob and opened the door. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty house, like a secret being revealed. The room inside was small, no bigger than a closet, and it was filled with strange, abandoned furniture. Old chairs with peeling upholstery, a dusty dresser with drawers that creaked when she opened them, and an ancient-looking mirror with a frame so twisted it looked like it was made from the gnarled branches of a dead tree. But what struck Megan most were the objects. odd trinkets and relics that didn't seem to belong. Old clocks, broken toys, strange carvings of faces, and a pile of forgotten books. Everything was covered in dust, as though no one had touched it in decades. Megan stepped inside, her sneakers crunching against the dusty floorboards. She felt a chill, a kind of heaviness in the air. The room didn't feel like it belonged to the house, like it was a place caught between worlds. The kind of room where time stopped. She moved slowly, taking in the oddities, drawn in by their strange allure. But it wasn't until she placed the first thing inside that things truly started to change. She'd picked up an old, broken toy soldier from the floor, its paint chipped and its face barely recognizable. Without thinking, she tossed it onto the dresser, just to see what would happen. The moment it landed, the air seemed to shift. The room grew colder, and Megan felt a strange pull, like the room had become hungry. She blinked, and the soldier was gone. Megan stared at the dresser, confused. Had she imagined it? Did it fall behind the dresser? She stepped closer, peering around it, but the toy soldier was nowhere to be found. She shook her head. What the heck? For a moment, Megan considered leaving. Maybe the room was just playing tricks on her, or maybe the house was creaking under the weight of its age, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She took another step inside, looking around for something else to touch, something to test. This time, she picked up a small, faded clock that had been sitting on the windowsill. Its hands were stuck, frozen at 3:15. She placed it gently on the floor of the room, next to the dresser. The air shifted again. Megan turned to look at the clock, and to her shock, it was gone. She stared at the empty spot where it had been, her breath catching in her throat. Her heart hammered in her chest as she reached down, hands trembling, but the clock was nowhere. It was as if the room had swallowed it whole. And then, before she could move, there was a sound, a soft, rhythmic ticking. It came from the direction of the dresser. She turned, her stomach twisting in knots. The clock. The hands were moving again, ticking away as if it had never been broken. Megan's pulse quickened. What was happening? Why had the objects vanished? And why had they come back changed? She stepped closer to the dresser, peering at the clock. The numbers were shifting, rearranging themselves as though they were being rewritten. The hands of the clock twisted violently, moving backwards and forwards at the same time, as if the room itself was distorting time. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the reflection of the mirror, a shadow, standing still, unmoving, just beyond the doorway. Megan's breath caught in her throat as she turned around, but there was nothing there. She felt a chill run down her spine. And that's when she realized something far more terrifying. Everything she placed inside the room changed. The toy soldier, the clock, even the strange items she had found in the drawers. When they came back, they weren't the same. The faces were different. The eyes were wrong. The clock's hands were twisting like fingers, and the soldier now had an eerie, twisted smile. Megan tried to leave the room, but something stopped her. The door wouldn't open. She pulled at the knob, panic rising in her chest, but the room seemed to be holding her in place, as if it didn't want her to leave. The items she had placed inside the room were beginning to change again, their forms warping, their shapes bending as if they were alive, pulling themselves together into something new, something monstrous. And then Megan realized the room wasn't just taking things. It was taking pieces of her, too. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut in her face. The objects, now twisted and alive, moved towards her, and Megan could feel her heart race as they reached out with fingers made of time itself. She could hear their whispers, soft but insistent, telling her that she was becoming part of the room now, she had been caught. The house didn't forget. It remembered. And the forgotten room. It was waiting. When they found her the next day, there was no sign of Megan. The door to the room was still locked, and everything inside it was as it had always been. But the mirror showed something else. A girl standing inside the room. Eyes wide, mouth open, frozen in place. And around her, the objects, now living, danced in twisted rhythm. The room had claimed her, and it was ready for the next. Story number 7. The Moonlit Path. Every town has its stories, its whispers, but in the little town of Grey Hollow, there was one tale that was always told in hushed voices, especially when the full moon was on the horizon. It was the kind of story that kept the kids inside after dark, eyes wide and minds racing with what-ifs. It was the tale of the Moonlit Path. No one really knew where the path came from or who had built it. It wasn't there during the day, just an empty stretch of woods, quiet and still. But when the full moon rose high in the sky, something strange would happen. A path would appear, winding through the trees, illuminated by the soft glow of moonlight. It wasn't like any other trail in the woods. This one felt different, alive, and no one who had ever followed it came back the same. The story had been passed down for generations, whispered between friends, shared as a warning. It was a path no one dared to walk. But, as with all things forbidden, there were always those who didn't listen to the warnings. That night, the full moon hung low, bright and ominous in the sky. 4 friends, Ben, Ellie, Sam, and Lily, sat on the old stone wall by the edge of the woods, looking at the moon with a mix of fear and excitement. "You believe it's real?" Ellie asked, her voice barely a whisper. She'd heard the stories just like everyone else, but she'd never truly believed them. After all, it was just a story, right? Just an old tale meant to keep kids out of the woods at night. Ben, the bravest of the group, grinned. "Of course it's real. There's got to be something to it. Why else would all the grown-ups talk about it in whispers?" He leaned forward, his hands tightening around the rough stone of the wall. "Tonight's the night. We're going to find out what's at the end of that path." Lily, who was always a bit more cautious, hesitated. "Are you sure? I mean, no one goes near that path. What if it's true?" Sam, always the skeptic, scoffed. "Come on, Lily. It's just a moonlit trail. You've got to admit it's kind of cool, right? I want to see what happens." Ellie nodded slowly. "I'm with Sam. If we're going to do it, let's do it tonight." With that, they set off, hearts pounding, but minds made up. The woods were eerily quiet as they crossed the line between the known and the unknown. The trees seemed to close in around them, the moonlight barely breaking through the canopy above. But as they walked deeper into the woods, something began to shift. The temperature dropped, and a strange, unsettling silence settled over them. Then they saw it. The path. It stretched out before them, glowing faintly under the full moon, the outline of each stone and root clearly visible. But there was something unnatural about it. It was too perfect, too well defined, as if it had always been there, waiting. Ben was the first to step forward, his boots crunching on the soft earth as he made his way down the path. The others followed, reluctantly at first, but curiosity pulled them forward. The deeper they went, the stranger it felt. The trees grew twisted, their branches bending in unnatural shapes, their leaves dark and jagged. The moonlight, once warm and inviting, now felt cold and distant, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. After what felt like hours, they reached a clearing. But it wasn't just any clearing. It was a place that none of them recognized. The sky above them had darkened, but the moon was still full, still bright, casting an otherworldly glow across the landscape. "Where are we?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't right." Sam shook his head, his face pale. "This isn't the woods we know. Everything's wrong." And then it hit them, the air. It was thick, heavier than they had ever felt it. It wasn't just the temperature, it was like the world itself was pressing in on them, suffocating them. And the sounds, there were no sounds. Not the rustle of leaves, not the call of an owl. Just silence, thick and suffocating. Ben stepped forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. "We've crossed into something else. This isn't our world." Ellie's breath caught in her throat. "You mean this is the other side of the path?" Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath them shifted. The trees seemed to bend and sway, their trunks creaking as though they were alive. The shadows grew longer, stretching toward them, like they were trying to pull them into the dark, and then they saw it. A figure standing just beyond the trees. It was tall, too tall, its body silhouetted against the bright moon. The figure didn't move, but it didn't need to. Its presence was enough to make their blood run cold. It was watching them. "Run!" Ben shouted. But as soon as they turned to flee, the path had disappeared. The woods around them had changed, twisted into something else entirely. No matter how fast they ran, no matter which way they turned, they were trapped. The figure's eyes glowed, red and full of malice, as it took a step forward, its long arms stretching toward them. "You can't leave," a voice echoed in their minds. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling, a presence that filled the air around them. "The moon is mine." Panic surged through them. They had to escape before the moon set, or they would be trapped here forever in this twisted, dark world. But as they ran, they realized something worse. The more they tried to escape, the more they saw things changing around them. The trees were shifting, the ground uneven and unstable, as if it were alive, watching, waiting for them to make a mistake. Ellie stumbled, falling to the ground as the world around them shifted again. She looked up, and for a moment she swore she saw the same figure standing before her, smiling. "Run!" Ben shouted again, grabbing her hand, pulling her to her feet. They had to move faster. With every step, they grew closer to the edge of the woods, to the place where the path had once been. The moon was beginning to fade, the light dimming, slipping away. And then, just as the last of the moonlight flickered, they broke through the trees. The world around them shifted again, and suddenly they were back in the familiar woods. The path was gone. The moon was dimming, as if nothing had ever happened. But they knew. They knew what they had seen, and they knew they had barely escaped. The woods, the path, it was still there, waiting for the next full moon. Waiting for someone else to follow, to cross the line. And the figure would never stop watching. Story number 8, The Ghost of the Carousel. The old amusement park sat at the edge of town, abandoned and forgotten, its once bright colors faded and peeling. Rusted gates lined the entrance, and weeds had long since claimed the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. But even though it had been shut down for years, the park still held a certain kind of magnetism, an eerie pull that drew kids like David, Emma, and Caleb. They'd heard the stories, tales passed around by older kids who had ventured too close to the gates and had seen strange things, heard faint carnival music playing in the dead of night, or caught glimpses of shadows moving behind the long abandoned rides. It was an old, decaying park that had once been full of laughter and life, but now it felt like something else, something far darker. One night, just after the moon had risen high in the sky, David, Emma, and Caleb stood at the rusted gates, daring each other to enter. The air was thick with the promise of adventure and the whisper of something far more dangerous. "I'll bet you can't do it," David teased, eyeing the carousel in the distance. The ride still stood tall, a forgotten relic from another time, its wooden horses frozen in mid-gallop, their once bright manes now covered in dust. Emma glanced at it nervously. "It's just an old ride," she said, though her voice betrayed the uncertainty she felt. Who knows what's really inside? Caleb, always the brave one, grinned. "We're going in. It's just a stupid carousel. Nothing's gonna happen." The group pushed through the rusted gate, the sound of their footsteps crunching on the gravel, mixing with the faint hum of the wind that seemed to carry an eerie echo. The carousel stood in the center of the park, its once vibrant paint now faded, the horses frozen in place, their eyes wide and lifeless. The old lights above the ride flickered faintly, like they were trying to hold on to something, as if the ride itself was reluctant to let go. "Ready to go for a spin?" David asked, grinning. They climbed onto the horses, the creaking of the old wood filling the silence. As they settled into their places, something strange happened. The music, which had been silent, began to play. A soft, haunting melody, like something pulled from a forgotten memory. The music was slow at first, barely audible, but then it picked up speed, louder and more insistent. The horses seemed to shift beneath them, their heads turning slightly, their eyes gleaming in the dim moonlight. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the carousel began to move, slowly at first, and then faster. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of the wind in the trees was replaced by a soft, rhythmic clattering. The sound of hooves. At first, it felt harmless, just an old ride creaking back to life. But then the horses started moving on their own, as if they had minds of their own. David's horse jerked forward, its hooves pounding louder than the others. He pulled on the reins, but it didn't stop. Caleb's horse spun in tight circles, its eyes wide and gleaming with something that wasn't right. And Emma's horse was moving faster, pulling her along, its mouth open in a silent scream. They tried to jump off, but the ride didn't stop. It only spun faster, the music growing louder and more distorted, like something ancient and hungry. The world around them seemed to blur as the carousel spun faster and faster, its wooden horses moving at impossible speeds. And then the lights flickered one last time. The world stopped. The three kids looked around, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the park was no longer the park they had known. The carousel was still spinning, but the other rides, the Ferris wheel, the bumper cars, the tilt-a-whirl, were gone, swallowed by darkness. The sky above them was no longer the soft glow of night. It was black, deeper than any night they'd ever seen. The trees that surrounded the park were twisted, their limbs like gnarled fingers reaching toward them, as if trying to pull them into the darkness. The carousel slowed, but they couldn't get off. The horses no longer looked wooden. They looked real, too real, like living creatures, their faces twisted in unnatural grins, their eyes dark and full of hunger. Caleb tried to scream, but his voice was lost, swallowed by the twisted landscape around them. Emma's heart raced as she realized the truth. The park, the carousel, was alive. And it wasn't done with them yet. Suddenly, the other horses, frozen in place only moments before, shifted. The riders who had once been part of the park, children like them, now stood behind the carousel, their faces hollow, their eyes glazed over. They were the lost souls, the ones who had ridden the carousel before and never returned. David's voice trembled as he whispered, "We need to get off. Now." But no matter how hard they tried, no matter how much they tugged and pulled at the reins, they couldn't stop. They couldn't get away. The ride was taking them somewhere that they couldn't escape from, somewhere that no one ever came back from. The souls of the past riders began to circle around them, reaching out, their hollow eyes begging for release. But there was no release, only the endless ride. They could hear it now, the sound of the wind howling in the distance. A low, ghostly wail that sounded like it came from the deepest corners of the earth, a sound that would never stop. The ride was never meant to end. It wasn't just a ride, it was a prison. The carousel spun faster and faster, and the faces of the old riders, who had never left, stared at them with eyes that were too empty, too hollow, too lost. And in the center of it all, the music played on. Forever. The next morning, the park was quiet again. The carousel stood still, its horses frozen once more in their positions. But if you looked closely enough, you might have seen the faintest movement in the shadows, the faintest whisper on the wind. And if you listened, really listened, you might hear the soft, distant echo of a haunting melody, calling out to anyone foolish enough to dare ride again. Story number 9. The Shadows Under the Bed. Maya had never been fond of the dark. It wasn't the kind of fear that made her scream or cry. No, her fear of the dark was quiet, sneaky. It crept in at night when the world was silent, and the only thing that kept her safe was the warm glow of her nightlight. But when she turned 10, something changed. It wasn't sudden, just little things at first. Strange noises in the middle of the night. Soft creaks in the floorboards when no one was moving. The shadows that moved when she wasn't looking. It started one night when Maya was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. She had turned off her nightlight, something she was trying to get used to. She was growing up, after all, and she didn't need a nightlight anymore. Or so she told herself. But she couldn't sleep. Her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't push away. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A shadow. It was small at first, just a flicker near the edge of her bed. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, and told herself it was nothing. Just the light from the window playing tricks. But the shadow didn't go away. It grew longer, stretching across the floor. Maya watched, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadow seemed to shift, moving with a life of its own, following her every movement. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She slowly lifted her foot, and the shadow did the same, mimicking her every move. It wasn't just one shadow anymore. There were several, crawling beneath her bed like dark tendrils reaching out from the darkness. As she pulled her foot back, the shadows pulled back too. But as she moved closer to the edge of the bed, the shadows grew longer, as if they were reaching for her, hungry, waiting. Maya's heart raced. She tried to ignore it, told herself it was just her imagination. But the shadows weren't going away. They were getting bolder, moving more quickly now, swirling around her legs, up the sides of the bed. At first, she tried to convince herself it was nothing, just shadows, nothing more. She told herself that if she didn't look, they would go away. But as the days passed, the shadows became harder to ignore. They followed her around the room, stretching out from under her bed, creeping up the walls, waiting in the corners. It was like they were alive. One night, after another restless evening of staring into the dark, Maya sat up in bed. She couldn't take it anymore. She had to know what was happening. The shadows were becoming more real, more terrifying every night. She climbed out of bed, her feet touching the cold floor. The shadows moved with her, their dark forms stretching and twisting in ways that didn't make sense. She hesitated, looking over at the edge of the bed. Her heart beat faster. "What do you want from me?" she whispered into the dark, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the soft rustle of the shadows as they seemed to grow larger, inching closer, beckoning her toward them. Her breath caught in her throat. She had to do something. She couldn't let them pull her under. She couldn't be like the other children she had heard of, the ones who had disappeared without a trace, leaving only whispers behind them. Maya knelt by the bed and slowly, hesitantly, peered under it. The shadows seemed to reach for her, their edges curling like fingers waiting to grab hold. She pulled back, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she did, something strange happened. She felt a coldness under her skin, a sensation that crawled through her veins. The shadows, the ones under the bed, weren't just shadows anymore. They were alive, and they wanted her. Her breath quickened. Maya couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the shadows seemed to swallow the room, encircling her, filling the space with their darkness. She could feel them tugging at her, pulling her toward the edge of the bed, pulling her closer to the dark underworld they came from. The fear that had been growing inside her reached its peak, and in that moment something inside her snapped. She had to fight, she had to get away. Maya scrambled backward, her hands gripping the floor, her legs trembling beneath her. She slammed her back against the wall, her eyes wide with terror. The shadows hesitated, as if they were confused, as if they didn't expect her to fight back. But Maya wasn't done. Not yet. She grabbed the flashlight from her nightstand and shined it under the bed. The shadows recoiled, retreating from the light, but they didn't disappear. They still moved, still shifted, as though they were waiting for her to make the wrong move. Maya swallowed hard, her mind racing. She remembered something. Something her grandmother had told her when she was younger, something about how light could defeat darkness. With shaking hands, she grabbed the nightlight from her shelf and plugged it in. The soft, comforting glow spread across the room. The shadows recoiled once again, this time farther, retreating into the dark corners of the room. Maya stayed there, breathing heavily, her eyes locked on the shadows that had once seemed so alive. She didn't dare look away, not for a second, as the light pushed them back. She didn't sleep that night. She didn't sleep for a long time after that. The shadows still lingered, but now they stayed hidden, far away, buried deep under the bed, where they couldn't hurt her. And though Maya had pushed them back for now, she knew the truth. The shadows weren't gone. They were just waiting for the right moment to return. And they always returned. Always. Story number 10. The Forgotten Toy. Ethan had always been a quiet, lonely kid. His parents worked long hours, leaving him to entertain himself, and the old house they lived in felt too big for just the three of them. The creaky floors, the dusty corners, the rooms filled with things that seemed to belong to someone else. It all made Ethan feel like he was trapped in a place where the past still lingered, unwilling to let go. One Saturday afternoon, when his parents were busy with errands, Ethan decided to explore the attic. He'd been up there a few times before, but there was always something about it that made him uncomfortable. The stairs groaned under his weight, and the air was thick with dust. The attic felt like a forgotten world, full of old things that nobody cared about anymore. But today, he couldn't shake the feeling that something important, was waiting for him. The attic was just as he remembered, piles of old boxes, forgotten furniture covered in sheets, and shelves filled with knickknacks that had long since lost their purpose. It was the kind of place where things were abandoned, things that no one needed, no one wanted. But as he wandered deeper into the room, something caught his eye. In the far corner, partially hidden behind an old trunk, was a small, dusty toy. It was an old wooden doll, its paint chipped and its clothes torn. At first glance, it seemed innocent enough. Just another forgotten item, tossed aside with all the other relics of the past. But something about it made Ethan's stomach turn. He reached out to touch it. The doll was surprisingly heavy, and its eyes, painted on with uneven strokes, seemed to stare right through him. A cold chill ran down his spine as he held it in his hands. It felt wrong. But it was just a toy, right? Just something old, left behind, forgotten. He set it down on the floor, trying to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up on him. That night, after dinner, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the doll. He kept seeing its eyes, watching him, even when he closed his own. The next morning, he found himself back in the attic almost without thinking. The doll was gone. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He searched the room, his breath quickening, but there was no sign of it. The attic was as it had been the day before, quiet, undisturbed. But when he turned to leave, something caught his eye. The doll was sitting on the top step of the attic stairs, staring up at him. His first instinct was to run, to ignore it, but curiosity pulled him in. He bent down and picked it up again. This time, its weight felt different, heavier, almost as though it had been waiting for him. As he held it, he heard a voice, faint, almost a whisper. "Play with me." The words echoed in his head, though the room was still. Ethan froze, his grip tightening around the doll. He felt it then, a strange compulsion, a pull in the pit of his stomach. The voice wasn't just in his mind, it was in the room with him, breathing on his neck. "Play with me." Ethan dropped the doll, backing away quickly. His heart was pounding. He couldn't explain it, but there was no denying it. The doll had spoken, and he had heard it. The room seemed darker now, more oppressive, as if something had shifted. He left the attic and went back to his room, but the feeling lingered. The doll was out there, waiting. Days passed, and the world around Ethan started to feel off. Little things at first. Objects out of place, the lights flickering when they shouldn't, strange shadows darting across the corners of his vision. But then the whispers began again. "Play with me." The voice was louder now, insistent, and each time it spoke, the world around Ethan seemed to warp just a little more. His room felt smaller. The walls seemed to close in on him, the air thicker, harder to breathe. He saw the doll again one night, sitting at the foot of his bed, its eyes staring up at him, unblinking. "Play with me, Ethan." The doll's voice was no longer a whisper, it was a command, and Ethan didn't know why, but he found himself reaching for it. The moment his fingers touched the doll, the world around him seemed to stretch and twist. The room was no longer his bedroom. It was dark, vast, and twisted, like a place that existed in between the cracks of his reality. The doll grinned, its painted face now twisted into something grotesque. "Now you will play forever," it said, its voice echoing through the distorted world. Ethan wanted to scream, but no sound came out. His body felt frozen, his hands still clutching the doll. The shadows in the room began to move, crawling toward him, wrapping around his legs, pulling him toward the doll. The more he struggled, the stronger the pull became. His heart raced, his mind screamed for him to stop, to let go, but the doll's grip was stronger than his. "Play with me," it whispered again, and this time Ethan felt something snap inside him. The toy was no longer a toy. It was something worse, something dark, something that wanted to consume him. It was a doorway, a portal into a world that was never meant to be touched. Ethan's vision blurred as he was pulled into the darkness. The room was gone, replaced by endless shadows, each one whispering his name. He was trapped in the twisted world of the doll, a place where time didn't exist, and the shadows were alive, whispering, crawling, always watching. When his parents came to check on him later that night, they found his room as it had always been, normal, quiet, with nothing out of place. The doll, however, was gone, and so was Ethan. And the house, once quiet, would never feel the same again. The whispers could be heard now if you listened closely enough. "Play with me," they would say. And in the darkness of the attic, the forgotten toy sat, waiting.